Good evening. I'm Andrew Natsios, the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M, and I'd like to welcome you this evening to our program. We have a very distinguished scholar and policy person who is the editor of the most influential journal probably in the world in foreign affairs, but I'm going to let our former department chair who went to college with graduate school with Gideon Rose introduce him. But what I'd like to do is just mention to everyone that they are being given cards by the Bush School ambassador for questions. Write your questions on the card and then pass them to either end, and the ambassadors will pick them up, and then Dr. Gause will read through them, and that will guide his conversation with Dr. Rose when they get up to sit on the stage. But Greg, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. And Andrew forgot, but I won't. Howdy. Howdy. Well, that's the official greeting of Texas A&M. So I'm here to say howdy to Gideon Rose, our speaker tonight. And it's a great pleasure to welcome him to the Bush School, to Texas A&M, and to College Station for the first time. Gideon is the Mary and David Boies Distinguished Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, he was editor of Foreign Affairs from 2010 to 2021, prior to which he was the managing editor of Foreign Affairs from 2000 to 2010. So over 20 years helping to guide what Andrew accurately said is the most influential journal of opinion on issues of international politics in the United States. Before that, he also served as Associate Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council at the White House, and was Deputy Director for National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations before he took up his editorial duties at Foreign Affairs. He's taught American foreign policy at Princeton University and Columbia University. He's the author of the book How Wars End, published by Simon & Schuster in October of 2010. He received his PhD in political science from Harvard University in 1994, a number of years after I was there, so he's younger than I am. We were actually not contemporaries, but that would be unfair to Gideon because he's a much younger person than I am. He received his BA in Classics from Yale University in 1985. Gideon will address us tonight on U.S. power and the future of international politics, after which he and I will have a bit of back and forth over in these chairs, and then take your questions, which, as Andrew said, you'll write on cards that the Bush School ambassadors will pass out to you shortly. But now, please help me welcome to the podium Gideon Rose.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Andrew, and howdy, all of you. I have to learn a new lingo to come down here. The shower in my hotel room was actually engraved with a logo, Gig'em Aggies. I'm not even sure what that means, although in New York it would mean go work for Uber. But I assume it doesn't mean that here. It's a great honor to be here, not just because I'm very impressed with these guys, but by the way, one of whom has done things, another of whom knows things. I'm just sort of a jack of all trade who was the editor who kept the conversation going. But it's great fun to be able to talk with them and with you guys. It's also great fun just to come to Texas. This allowed me to chalk off a bucket list item and make a pilgrimage yesterday to Franklin's Barbecue, which was absolutely spectacular and definitely worth it, 3-hour wait and all included. Really, really fun. Everything in Texas is big, and after a couple of days here, so am I, which is a little bit. So today I'm gonna give you 3 stories and 2 challenges. Why stories? Our brains are hardwired to see things in patterns. This is true of our visual systems, right? That's why those CAPTCHAs and those little tests that say, I am not a robot, because we're very good, our eye complex is very good at telling a street lamp or a crosswalk or a speedboat, and the computers as yet are not that good, and so that's one way you can tell. But just like our eyes and our optical complexes tend to see patterns very easily. So our brains cognitively think about history and the world in terms of stories and narratives. The postmodernists are probably, they can make a very good case that actual history is like a Jackson Pollock painting, a giant complete mess of endless dots with lots of connections. But even if it were true that that was the case, we would resist that conclusion because we impose order on it. We make sense of the world through the stories we tell about it. We make sense of history through the stories about it. So there is always a sort of, or usually, a reigning narrative, a story about the world that we tell ourselves and that foreign policy is guided by. And what's interesting and what I'm going to talk today about is the fact that there have been three of those stories, three different stories told in the last generation. And it's relevant to what we're doing now and how we go forward. In the 1990s, the conventional wisdom about international politics was what you might call the liberal story. This was a story of individuals and institutions, right? You know it from Frank Fukuyama, you can know it from John Eikenberry. It's the story that we Americans are most familiar with naturally and historically. And it basically goes something like this. People are people everywhere. They're pretty much the same. They are self-interested at some level, although they have the ability for enlightened self-interest to see their own interest as well as those of others. And they are reasonably, kind of, sort of rational. And because of these characteristics of individuals who are reasonably self-interested and reasonably rational, what matters in history are the contexts in which those individuals find themselves, the political and economic structures that they exist within, which either liberate this human nature and these qualities and allow it to work well, or frustrate it and channel it into negative or bad impulses. And the liberal story of world politics is one, therefore, about changes over time in institutional structures, politically and economically and socially, which take a sort of common human nature and allow it to flower or to flourish or to be cramped, right? And so the liberal story is one in which the United States is the avatar of a modern future in which democratic political institutions and relatively free markets aggregate and channel human preferences into mutually beneficial outcomes that are stable and provide a positive petri dish for human flourishing. And the story the liberals tell is one in which democracy as a set of political institutions, liberal democracy more generally, has not only evolved over time, but allowed different groups to live together, gotten over the problem with domestic sovereignty and power by creating a sort of system that is checked internally at any given moment while also allowing possibilities for renewal, and that this aggregates political choices and interests and allows them to move forward, and that over time there's a kind of rational public that retrospectively votes, that moves things forward, that has a collective self-interest that gets expressed in better policies. And that economics in the markets work the same way, that there is an invisible hand, as Adam Smith said, that funnels the self-interest of liberal individuals into working, whether they realize it or not, for the collective benefit, that the profit-mindedness of the baker and the butcher and the candlestick maker allows them to follow the signals from the market, produce and generate goods, and that when this is allowed to work, the result is a progressive growth and a progressive dynamism economically. And the story liberals tell And the story that seemed quite plausible and was reigning conventional wisdom in the 1990s was that this is what was playing out not just in the United States, but in the world at large. That we were seeing the triumph of free markets, free politics, free societies, and that ever more of the world was corralled into these freer institutions, they too would not only join and strengthen the liberal community, but would progress forward themselves, and that this progress would be recognized and built upon. And it's not that the millennium would arrive tomorrow or was already here, but that the trends forward would be continued and sustained as a globalized market would be ever more productive and valuable and richer and pay benefits to people, as a global community of democracies would be ever more peaceful, and as free societies would allow individuals to fulfill their human potential in ever greater ways. This story did not do so well. It did very well in the 1990s, and it seemed to be a sort of reflection of how things were going. But by the 2000s, it was displaced by another story. Primarily, the turning point came on 9/11. And the story of the 2000s, the conventional wisdom, was, you might call it, the civilizational story. And the civilizational story said, this is not about individuals and institutions. It's about groups of people and culture. And that's what really is important, that people's communal nature and their culture is really what matters. And it's what drives different groups of people in different directions and to different endpoints. And what had been a sort of liberal cosmopolitan community of the West with free markets and free politics as the avatar or as the leading edge of the world, became a Western civilizational story of a sort of expanded modern Christendom, essentially, confronting a Muslim world that was civilizationally different, culturally different, and problematic because of its culture. And that the world essentially was one in which these different large cultural groups were in conflict and were going to go towards different outcomes because of their cultural nature, right? My old advisor, Sam Huntington, framed this in his Clash of Civilizations. It was sort of radical at its time and roundly denounced in the 90s by the liberal conventional wisdom. After 9/11, a lot of people, well, hey, maybe he was right, and maybe there are indeed things to these civilizations. And for a long number of years, we found ourselves wrapped up in what seemed a civilizational conflict. One between civilizations, or in its more starkest form, one which we were told was one between civilization and itself and barbarism. But essentially, this was a different story about the world. And what it led to was a different set of policies. Within a number of years, as those policies and that world, as the war on terror seemed to ebb, as those policies produced some unintended negative results, it ended up getting displaced by a third conventional wisdom, which started to take shape in the teens, and you might say has come now to be the dominant conventional wisdom. And this is the realist story of the world, and it features states and power. The realist story isn't about institutions and individuals. It's not about culture and civilizations. It's about an age-old minuet of states in an international system jockeying with each other for power in the most straightforward of ways. And so now great power competition is the phrase of the day. This has been not just a Trump phenomenon, but was carried over essentially into the Biden administration. We all are looking at China not as a civilizational threat, not as a different set of institutions, but rather as a rival great power. We're looking at Russia and seeing it as a rival power. And there's a tension and a sense that we are back in a mere chimerian world of jockeying states that ever cycle back and forth. And the liberals were seen as naive for thinking you could get beyond that, and the civilizational types are seen as a little bit sort of crazy for putting too much of an emphasis on culture, and the sober, conservative, small c realists who believe in prudence and restraint and avoiding conflict or preparing for conflict are the ones who are now in the saddle. The very fact that we have had three different stories, three different conventional wisdoms within a generation, each gaining huge credence and widespread support, both among intellectuals and policymakers and the public at large, should tell us something. The first is that it's highly unlikely that the new conventional wisdom is likely to be the last word on things. And the second is that we should probably be a little bit sort of humble. What's also interesting is that none of these stories is actually new. They're all pretty age-old stories in a certain respects with a long set of traditions behind them. It's Ross Douthat, the conservative columnist for the New York Times, had a nice little book that was published just before the pandemic called The Age of Decadence. And one of his theories is that everything old is new again, and we're just in an age of decadence in which everything is recycled. And I was thinking about that as I was putting together this talk, because the fact that all of our three reigning recent conventional wisdoms or have long pedigrees and have been around before, in many ways sort of substantiates Ross's thesis that there's an eternal return and we're sort of stuck like endless Marvel reruns and endless remakes of different movies. So we're stuck in an IR theory Groundhog Day in which we're just doomed to replicate all the debates of the past. So with that, it's actually interesting to go back and take a look. You might almost think of it as like a fourth meta story, which is of how we've thought about the system and the world and the progress of history with a capital H over time in the West. Because we've been having debates like this, or intellectuals and policymakers have been having debates like this for literally thousands of years over the exact same set of issues. And their answers have changed and evolved, but also cycled back a lot over the years. So it's interesting to think about that. The classical world, which was kind of stuck in economic stagnation, without much economic growth, without much political progress that was sustainable, had a very realist view of things in today's terms. It was captured well by Marcus Aurelius, who was not just a Roman emperor, but also a Stoic philosopher. And he says in his Meditations, look at the past, empire succeeding empire, and from that extrapolate the future. No escape from the rhythm of events, which is why observing life for 40 years is as good as 1,000. Would you really see anything new? So here's Marcus Aurelius. Literally, by the time you're 40, you've seen everything, because everything is just a constant replay. Right? This is very much what John Mearsheimer would say, and this is what the realist worldview sort of has in its origins. It gets systematized later on in modern realist kind of things, but this is a pretty simple, straightforward. So then you get Christians who come along and say, no, there can be progress. There can be a better future. They give human life, compared to the pagans, a second act, but that act is located off stage in heaven. Okay, so for the Catholic Church, or for the original Christian Church, life will get better, but not this life. There's another life that'll be better after this life. And for 1,000 years, you end up getting a second story, not of perpetual cycling and return, but of which that's true of this world, and there's a seamless interconnected web of authority from the household to the feudal lord to the king potentially above that to the pope above that, and to God in his heaven ruling above everything in general, that there's a sort of stable macrocosm in the celestial sphere and a stable microcosm reflecting it down here. And that there is going to be a better future. The wicked will be punished and the good will be rewarded, but it's going to come after, in the next world. Then you get the Reformation, the Renaissance first, and then the Reformation, and you have a new kind of vision in which the Protestants come along and say, okay, yeah, there's going to be this future world where things are better, but we'll be able to tell what your future is going to be by how you do in this world. It's not that you can change the future or make it better, but you can reveal the predestined future by how well you do in this world. And so you get a frenzied activity in the Protestant world of work and discipline to show not just how well you will do in the future world, but also to basically change the politics of this world. The early saints are real wreckers politically. They're not quiescent at all. They're actively engaged in building a new world, not too much, changing politics to show the new world that will come, but to show it here. From there, after the Protestants, you get the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, it's only one step to basically say, to take God out of the picture entirely and say, okay, yeah, there's not just going to be a new world that we're revealing, but we're creating it ourselves. And the future that was distantly there and then was going to be revealed by our actions is actually going to be created by our actions. And so the Protestants basically, the Enlightenment thinkers, they look at human nature and instead of seeing it as irredeemably sinful, they see it as good or as possible to be made good or as, even if it's not so good, aggregatable into systems that will channel its effects positively, like the market, like separated powers and balance of power domestically and things like that. And the Enlightenment liberal view is the origin of the liberal view that I mentioned before. And you have essentially the 18th century and the 19th century in which this starts to take off, but human nature, or rather human affairs, don't come to the kind of Comtean perfection, Condorcet type perfection that the liberals had expected. In fact, it's not particularly satisfying, and the liberal vision of the world, the Enlightenment liberal vision of the world, proves largely unsatisfying. And you end up getting instead socialists who think of it as a dynamic, dialectical thing that is going to move forward a process and will lead towards a better future through economic progress and class struggle. You see nationalists who find communities the source of the progress. Also see a kind of dialectical progress going forward, but seeing it almost as the larger group unit, right? And that's the origin in many respects of the civilizational stuff that we were talking about. In the 19th century after Darwin, you can see a kind of social Darwinism of races and empires that's very similar to the civilizational viewpoint we were talking about a little bit earlier. And you get various kinds of modern secular religions to replace the psychologically needed, to replace the old religions that have gone, that are no longer sort of intellectually viable, they would say. And this all culminates by the end of World War II, okay? So you have by 40, yeah, it's funny, in the 1750s there was an earthquake in Lisbon, and it killed a lot of small kids, and it killed a lot of innocent people. And the philosophers, like Voltaire, used this as an example to mock how anybody could think that this was the best of all possible worlds, that there was some benign deity ruling over things. If you think of Candide, this actually plays in the play Candide. 200 years later, okay, by the 1940s, the the death camps, the gulag, the bomb. These are much worse in many respects than the Lisbon earthquakes. And they sort of put paid to the kind of notion that simple human, secular management is going to work out for the best and do everything and make everything good and nice. And so by the mid-century, by the mid-20th century, you kind of have run through all the various changes, and you end up getting a postmodernist kind of view in which nothing matters, there is no story, there's no progress, there's just various kinds of chaos. You got an existential attitude, right? And it takes victory in the Cold War, the rise of the new economy after the stagflation and troubles of the 70s, the triumph of the liberal West, to resuscitate the liberal view, right? If Fukuyama had published his article in his book in the 1970s, he would have been laughed out of town because it seemed like humans didn't know how to run anything. Nobody knew how to do anything. There were no gods, there was no progress, there was nothing going forward. By the 1990s, however, remarkably, the liberal story of free markets and free politics and free societies working together in a kind of integrated whole seemed to be working out just like the philosophers had said. The United States was stronger than ever, and, you know, in the George H.W. Bush presidency, you saw the world go from a contested situation to one in which a new world seemed to be dawning. One that really was not a new world but so much as an extension of the liberal Western order with a new lease on life to a new globalized situation. And then, of course, you had the changes rung that I started with. So what does this tell us about where we are now? The first, and where are we going forward? The most interesting part of this is none of the stories have been disproven, and none of the stories have been fully proven. If you were to walk around College Station, any decent-sized city in America, you'd be likely to find Stoics, Catholics, Protestants, liberals, socialists, nationalists, postmodernists, all sort of still thinking that their story was going to play out, and each sort of feeling that history was rendering a sort of Scottish verdict, unproven yet on the question. It's a very interesting situation because it should introduce epistemological and heuristic humility in us. The fact that we've been having these debates and have not yet gotten to any kind of consistent answer, and in fact keep drawing on different traditions that are true, that were developed in the past to try to explain things. What are the challenges? There are two challenges. The first challenge is intellectual. Policy, foreign policy, has to depend on, be situated in some broader view of the world. This is what IR theory is all about. The first challenge, therefore, today for American foreign policy is an intellectual challenge. It may sound like all the stuff that I was just talking about was a bunch of intellectual, namby-pamby, silly stuff, not very practical, not very anything. But it matters hugely because the broader picture you tell yourself, the broader story that we collectively tell ourselves about history, about what drives it, about which way the system is going, is absolutely crucial because it provides a touchstone for everything else you do. Everybody can debate different kinds of policies in different ways, but the broader structure of the view of the world is absolutely crucial to making it be more than just completely arbitrary, a complete matter of individual taste or preference. To give any kind of intellectual coherence to what you're doing, you have to have a meta-structure, a meta-theory, a theoretical picture of the world and its history. So we have no choice but to answer, or at least address, the questions I was talking about, even if we know we're not going to come to any good answers. My response to that intellectual challenge of, okay, so what is your theory of the world? What is the broader structure of history into which you are going to pour and align your basic practical policies? Is the following. It seems to me that if you take seriously the history that I was just saying before, then it means that you should be somewhat humble in your epistemological and heuristic views. And not only that, is it unlikely for any one of those, any of the theories, either of those three or any other, to be completely correct, but recognizing the role of chance and human agency, which none of the theories really does particularly well, brings in other factors. If we're honest, if we look at the past, we can see lots of turning points that failed to turn. We can see lots of roles of individuals. We can see lots of chance events. And those have to be taken into account in our theories. There's a tendency for every new generation, every new crop of policymakers, even individuals, to resolve the cognitive difficulties and uncertainty that we face in looking at the world and not knowing things by settling on a kind of answer. It's very comforting to have an answer. But intellectually, it's really more plausible to resist having too strong an answer, okay? And it seems to me that the appropriate response to the intellectual history is to have a little bit of humility and to look for syncretic solutions, to recognize that each of those theories was pointing to certain kinds of variables, and that those variables probably do matter to a certain extent, and that no one of them matters to the exclusion of everything else. Right? There are individuals who are in effect generic leaders. You don't need to tell the story because the broader forces around them push them around. I had a senator named Al D'Amato when I was growing up in New York, and he was not a bad senator, but you knew with whatever the political forces around him were at the time, Al D'Amato would follow those political forces. And so you didn't really need to have a theory of Al D'Amato that much because the structural forces and the political situation around him were gearing what he was doing. There are leaders like that. There are leaders who make their impact on history instead, who believe strongly, who act strongly, who are different. We can all think of different examples of that. But we should understand that those things matter as much and that our own agency can affect the world. So if we take the history seriously, we know that institutions matter, both political and economic, but they're not completely determinative. We know that culture can matter. There do seem to be persistent patterns in various places that do seem affected by certain kinds of cultural attributes, but there are obviously vastly more exceptions than there are regularities. And while the eternal run of power matters, there are lots of different kinds of power, and no one particular form is dominant at any given time or for all time. And as well, there have been changes in the international system that weren't supposed to happen. Okay, unipolarity was not supposed to be a possibility to a certain extent in the realist world, and yet we sort of had it, and we're facing the question now of how much we still have it, and so forth. The European Union was literally not supposed to be able to exist. In a realist world, groups pooling their sovereignty to come together in a collective thing, that doesn't happen. So all these stories point to some elements of truth, and all of them are there, and it seems to me that the intellectually appropriate framework to have as you approach foreign policy is to say there are lots of variables that can matter, and to look very pragmatically. If someone says, what kind of ist are you? I like to think of myself as a pragmatist and an empiricist. To look very specifically at the situations in front of you and say, what are the variables that are mattering here? Are there countries, are there situations or regions, are there issue areas in which one of these traditions is more helpful or useful in explaining things? Are there times and places in which one of these things is more appropriate? If not, how do you mix the variables and bring in and tell a somewhat more multi-layered story? And most importantly, does it comport with the actual details and facts within which you're operating? So a sort of pragmatic, syncretic, and somewhat humble, epistemologically, viewpoint on IR theory seems to be appropriate. My father, what are the implications for policy from this? That's the second challenge. The first challenge is intellectual. The second challenge is, okay, if this is your nice, pragmatic, wussy, syncretic view of history and the world, what are the policies that flow from that? My dad used to say, he was a very wise man, if 3 people tell you you're drunk, go and lie down. And it's a good line, and it reflects the notion that whatever you may think, there are other people out there who probably have a viewpoint that it's worth taking into account. As Jefferson said, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. And one of the things is whatever theory we have, whatever our framework and whatever our viewpoint on policy, there are others in the system out there, and we might want to take those into account as well. In the 2004 election, there was a big debate about whether the UN should be given a veto power or the international community should be given a veto power over the world. Kerry had made some silly comments to that effect, and it was taken up and fought over. And I don't think of it as veto. I always thought it was kind of silly because it's not so much veto power as common sense. If you think, for example, about Canada and the UK and Australia, just to take 3 countries, right? If the United States wants to do something in foreign policy, and it can't convince Canada, the UK, and Australia to come on board, who are, if not vassals, then at least sort of, Robins to our Batman, who are incredibly culturally linked, who are incredibly generally pro-American and sympathetic to us, who are inclined to do whatever Washington tells them, although they don't say it in that way. If you have a policy that is opposed by Canada, the UK, and Australia, we should probably rethink that policy. Not because there's some objective veto that we should give the international community, because it's kind of like 3 people telling you you're drunk, go and lie down. By the same token, if you have a policy that is backed by, as it were, multiple theories, right, then that's probably a stronger, more robust policy to follow than one that relies on only one being correct. The Cold War, we can fight over it again and again on whether it was power-based or ideological-based. The fact that it was both power and ideological-based, actually that recommends it because it doesn't matter about getting the actual specific theory right if multiple theories tell you the same kind of thing. So you want to look for policies that meet with general approval from other people, or at least aren't completely resisted by others, because if what we're doing is reasonably sensible, there probably will be some common interest involved, and it will be recognized as such. You want to do something that's robust across a bunch of different views of the world and doesn't depend on a deeply idiosyncratic thing. You want to have something that is appropriate to the situation involved. We tend, I'll take wars for example, we tend to fight over justifications of principle. This is something we ought to do. This is something we should do. We don't fight as much over the really practical things like, is this something we can do, right? How often do you hear people say, can we achieve the specific goal we have just set for ourselves? And if we can't, maybe we should set a somewhat different goal. We fight over which goal? No, this goal. No, I want that goal. No, this kind of goal is stupid. No, this kind of goal is the right one. Whereas in fact, there may be many goals that are worthwhile and valuable, but only some that are appropriate or possible to be achieved in any given situation. And the extent to it, Greg is the world's expert, I would say, the greatest American expert on Saudi Arabia. And for decades, he has been trying to teach me that my naive liberal views about political evolution in the Middle East are highly unlikely to be achieved, and that it's actually probably counterproductive to try to push too hard in that direction. And I have finally, after decades of banging my head against the wall, come to a much greater appreciation and sympathy for his view, which doesn't mean that either he or hopefully I are evil, Mr. Burns, rubbing our hands in glee at the authoritarianism of Saudi Arabia, but rather recognizing that there are sort of times and places in which it's possible to achieve certain kinds of goals and certain kinds of methods, and that those should be brought into the policy discussion in the beginning, not in the end. we can get into a variety of specific cases in the question and answer, and I want to leave a lot of time for that rather than, ramble and filibuster. But essentially, I think that this notion of not just epistemological and hermeneutic, as it were, sort of humility and the implications of that, but dealing with the world as it is, not as we want it to be, having a due appreciation for the virtues of all the different elements in the picture, all the different variables that could be operating, is the right way to go, and it creates the right context for the actual policies and the arguments over policies that we can and should be having. The specific things I would say is that, just to get into a few more specific points before we get to the Q&A, power is generally a good thing. And too much power can be problematic and can lead you into silly endeavors, but a nice surplus and a nice positive balance of power in your favor in a variety of ways is a good thing. And so given that there are so many different sources of power in the system, hard and soft, long-term and short-term, it seems to me that cultivating multiple sources of power is a very sensible thing to do. Rather than fighting over which of them is more important, short-term hard power, okay? Think of it as the ability to send Ukraine HIMARS, right? We want to resupply Ukraine without denuding our own defenses. Well, okay, and we want to supply them with stuff that will beat up the other guys. That's a very good kind of power to have. It gives us a whole lot of advantages. The U.S. military budget is pretty high in objective terms, but lower than it could be, has been at other times. And I used to be concerned about what was generally termed, waste, fraud, and mismanagement, and think of it in a more sort of efficiency perspective. I once asked Colin Powell, could you get the same benefit for half the military budget in terms of national security? And he was like, oh, absolutely, as long as you let me do a line item, cut of what things get cut. If you just cut it by half or you let Congress do it, it'll be awful. But as I've gotten older and as I've seen the kind of realist realities of the world come back into play, it seems to me that a nice substantial military budget and a sort of surplus of a lot of kinds of good, hard, short-term military power and old-fashioned power is a very good thing to have. I was listening to a talk on China and all the various futures with China. I'd like to have even more of a Navy. I'd like to have an even stronger. I wouldn't want to use it and deploy it in ways that are provocative, but having the wherewithal, as we can see in something like Ukraine, to be able to do things is a good thing. But there's long-term hard power, and that comes from economics. That comes from the ability to generate the short-term hard power. And that comes from innovation, it comes from scientific progress and technological development, and investing in good national finances and basic science research, and having your economy be one that is not so constricted that it can continue to grow is clearly a vastly important long-term goal. And so the economic policies that essentially fuel better growth are a crucial form of long-term hard power. Okay? But soft power is important as well. Again, you look at Ukraine, telling the truth about what the Russians were going to do, saying they're going to attack, and they're going to attack here, and they're going to attack now, and then being proven right about it, that gives you a kind of credibility. And being on the side of the people who are resisting the war crimes and trying to fight them off, as opposed to being part of the people committing them, gives you points and gives you stature. And short-term soft power in terms of credibility, in terms of reputation, in terms of people wanting what you have and admiring you, is a very good thing. That's short-term soft power, and we should do those things. They're not wussy, silly things. They're things that enable you to partner with others and develop partners. But long-term soft power in terms of the institutional structure, the reputation you have over a long time. Think of it as the U.S. brand. Which enables people to cooperate with you, to trust you, to depend on you, is also very important. And investing in the kinds of relationships and institutions and behaviors that enable you to have long-term brand quality is crucial as well. So all these kinds of things, it's not one or the other, it's all those kind of things. And then the question about deploying them wisely when they're needed, but not when they're not needed is crucial. And what we've basically seen is in the 21st century, we've done a lot of stupid things. And we have not only deployed our power in ways that were counterproductive, but we've also often not deployed it when it might be positively constructive. And so those kinds of attributes and those kinds of qualities are the policy responses, I think, to the appropriate intellectual response to where are we in the U.S. system. And with that, I'll let Greg take more stuff going on forward as we go into details.
Please, I think that you're probably a fan of George H.W. Bush.
Yes, in terms of his foreign policy, absolutely. I was a volunteer in 1980 for George H.W. Bush's presidential primary campaign in New York.
Well, you made
Our slogan was conservative on economics, moderate on social issues. It was like a conservative, liberal, and moderate kind of thing across the board. It was.
And he lost, but that's okay. He became vice president and was eventually.
That was a time when Republicans had, this was the Metropolitan Republican Club. Bill Green was my congressman.
Yeah.
Roy Goodman was my state senator. So there was a whole tradition of Javits Republicans in New York, which is not the case anymore.
Well, one of the things we're doing down here is maintaining the George Bush's foreign policy tradition of pragmatism and prudence in playing a very good geopolitical hand.
It's so funny, everyone remembers, well, maybe the older people might remember Dana Carvey's SNL imitation. Not going to do it. Wouldn't be prudent. It seemed like something to be funny and mock. And if you think about it in perspective, after the last 30 years, I just would love the idea of somebody in the White House, going, not going to do it. Wouldn't be prudent, because that's exactly what we've lacked for the last 30 years. So.
You can go over to the museum next door and see that Dana Carvey routine, which is in President Bush's Presidential Museum right here in College Station. All right, so let me push back on one thing, and then I'm going to collect cards while you answer that. So it seems to me that actually there's a lot more consistency in the way the United States has dealt with this than the three stories imply. The three stories are there, but the consistency seems to be we treat enemies like realists, and we define enemies by ideology, right? And if you look at the Biden national security policy, he brings back this democracy thing, right? We stand for democracy. We want a coalition of democracies. We want to stand against the authoritarians, and we're going to treat them, in a realist way like enemies. We're gonna cut them off, we're going to contain them, and we're going to make life miserable for them. And that seems to me kind of what we did in the Cold War, kind of what we did after 9/11, or tried to do after 9/11. Tell me if I'm wrong.
So I think,
and bring me some
I
questions.
think there's a point there, but I think it's overstated. Because if you look at the sort of decoupling we're attempting with China, it's relatively modest. It is not anywhere near a full-scale cutoff, and we've been really resistant to it, and it would probably take a couple of more administrations and a couple of more tense cycles for it to really happen. It's more rhetoric than reality. And in terms of the democracy, those were our friends. As you well know, Saudi Arabia is about as far from a democracy as possible, and yet it took them literally siding with the Russians on the opposite side and screwing us with a new kind of oil crisis for the White House to do anything that was actually more than just a rhetorical spanking. So I don't. And
As far as I can tell, they haven't done anything.
Exactly. So I think that there's a lot more. I once told foreigners that it was more useful to listen to U.S. foreign policy, to watch U.S. foreign policy like watching TV with the sound turned off. Watch what the U.S. does, not what it says, because of our political cycle and because we demand that, there's a constant churn in rhetoric, and each administration has to distinguish itself from the previous one and blacken the memory of the previous one. But there's actually often less change than meets the eye. There is occasionally change, but I remember actually from the Bush administration, I was an official in the Clinton administration in the first term, and there were very little differentiation on policies between Bush 41 and Clinton. But there was a need to basically heighten the contradictions for political reasons. And I thought this was so stupid because I was still naive and didn't realize how much politics drove everything. But essentially it made me realize that not listening to what people were saying, but instead just watching what they were doing was like in a good a three-card Monte game was the right way to approach American foreign policy.
So in kind of a repeat of that, but more specifically, one of the folks in the audience says, would it be reasonable to assume that the new story is the new conventional wisdom is a mix of the first and the third, right? It's a mix of the liberal story and the realist story, and we see that in the reaction to Ukraine.
So I think so, but I think what's most fascinating to me is how there is no consensus on the story at all now. And even the new great power story is being overturned by the last couple of years. So if you take 2 years ago, there's always a time lag between the conventional wisdom changing and the events underneath it. But the story about great power conflict being the main thing of the day and the U.S. being in decline and falling backwards was much more plausible before China imploded during COVID, during the later stages in particular with its zero COVID policy in which it privileged control and in which it's screwing its own economy by clamping down, and in which Russia basically invaded Ukraine at huge cost to its reputation, to its resources, to its global position. And at this point, Russia has lost, no matter whether the Ukrainians fully win, Russia has certainly lost in big ways. And so the problems with illiberal regimes in terms of isolated leaders who basically make stupid decisions and who have succession challenges as well, is now coming to the fore. And Francis Fukuyama has actually just wrote a piece last month saying, you see, this proves I was right. All those people who said liberalism was doomed to fail by in contest with these new authoritarian leaders, you're already seeing the new authoritarians run into troubles like the old authoritarians did. And the fact that Latin America now is not going right-wing populist, but is elected leftist leaders across the board shows there's kind of a cycle. So to me, what's fascinating is the churn and the fact that whichever place you look, it's like watching a game in which each side is trying to lose. If you look at China, you say these guys can't possibly win. Look at what they're doing. If you look at Russia, you go, these guys can't possibly win. You look at us and you say, look, these guys are in complete internal chaos and tearing each other apart. They can't exercise any leadership. The Europeans are as much of a joke as they've always been. Latin America has had another lost decade in a way that was unimaginable 15 years ago or so. So there is no story which is actually really interesting, and why I tell my students that it's more fun to do this stuff now. It's scary, but it's more fun than it was, because the one thing we know is there are no answers. We don't have anything to teach you except how to think intelligently about the world going forward. It's certainly no actual substance or no actual answers, unlike the people in the natural sciences.
Does admitting illiberal regimes into liberal institutions risk illiberalizing those institutions?
It's a great question.
China into the WTO?
So it's a great question, and I think the answer is which institution. If you take something like the UN Human Rights Council, which is a joke, not least because its express purpose is to protect human rights, and you have a whole bunch of regimes that are gross violators of those rights who do it. But that doesn't mean that the UN itself necessarily has to have a test for global order. And it doesn't necessarily mean that different levels. So I think that if the essence of your regime is purely liberal, and you require liberals, and then to compromise too much on that by bringing in people would be problematic.
So that's the EU.
What?
That's the EU, right?
Yeah, you should have
purely
the
liberal, but
What?
it's
Yeah.
a purely liberal international organization.
Yes.
So a place like Hungary, which is becoming.
So this is a great question. There was a wonderful, Celeste Walder wrote a great piece when the first round of NATO expansion was going on, that basically said this is the time to have not just criteria for going in, but criteria for going out.
Yeah.
And we didn't do that, but absolutely. Hungary is making a mockery of the EU and should face greater penalties.
NATO as well, right?
NATO is an interesting
is
question
NATO gonna
because
be- is
NATO,
NATO
the old
purely
NATO was
liberal?
not particularly liberal.
No, I mean,
And
Portugal was in the original NATO, and
Exactly,
it was a
and,
fascist dictatorship.
You know, Turkey. NATO there are some countries that are really interesting and difficult challenges. We used to have what's called a friendly tyrant problem, and we still have it in some places. But a lot of the old tyrants, like Egypt or Pakistan, or some places in the Middle East, or Saudi Arabia being a good example, are not as powerful as they used to be, and so we don't have to make the kind of compromises necessary. A country like Turkey is really interesting because Erdogan's a canny, savvy, practical, strong leader, but he's also a bastard, and he's not a Democrat, and so we kind of have to. We can't afford to completely alienate him and follow just our principles, but we also want to have a way to not have him tarnish everything else. And it's interesting. There's always that. I think there should be separate extra institutions that are liberal. That in effect you can give the democracies an extra bonus credit, but not necessarily say we're only going to ally with democracies, because there are a lot of times when you want to ally with non-democracies, as we have often in the past.
So if there's any more cards, bring them up because we're almost out of time. You hinted at this. One of the questions from the audience is about the U.S. lack of public cohesion, of our own internal differences, and what does that mean for our foreign policy?
This is one of the biggest things I've had to learn. I realized that I was deeply bubbled, and that we can have and one of the ways a lot of us are bubbled, but one of the ways in which I was bubbled was in this kind of technocratic elite in which all these people would discuss what the right policy should be as if just the professional technocrats' view of what the right policy should be, or the IR professor's view, or the policy people's view, what's the right one. And the public has a vote too, and clearly domestic political sustainability has to be a crucial component of foreign policy going forward. And so the challenge is to not just ignore public concerns and isolate it and hive off foreign policy like the Federal Reserve does monetary policy, which is what I sort of would have liked to do back when I was a young, silly, naive technocrat, but rather, nor just to give in to democratic whims when it's a stupid policy thing, but to find some way of settling on the kind of least common denominator goals, the biggest, most obvious goals. Just like I said, we want to look for places where we can get the most buy-in from other countries and other allies. So we want to focus on the kinds of issues that have the most buy-in among the public, the least costs, and that kind of thing.
Right, but right now, that seems to be a new Cold War with China.
So
that is the one bipartisan foreign policy we seem to have now.
I agree, and I think that the answer there is to try to. I actually think the Biden administration has the right idea in using that rhetorically as a spur to the kind of domestic reinvestment. So, you can't have a sort of a pro-China or even by the way, it's kind of interesting to watch the new Yellow Peril arise, just like we watched the new Muslim peril arise, just like after a while, these cycles of public scaring, they no longer, I used to be amused, now I'm just disgusted. But there's a real danger of going too anti-China in the public debate now. And so but you can't fight against that. So political reality means at least tipping your cap in that direction, but trying to move the policy in a way that achieves practical goals without doing stupid, provocative things.
Right. Can we have a Cold War with a country with whom we have enormous amounts of trade, that holds a substantial proportion of our debt, that relies on our markets for any hope of its continued economic growth?
So this is so interesting and such a great question. when we were growing up, there was IR and security studies over here, and there was IPE, or International Political Economy, over here. And they were separate fields. And they were separate fields because they seemed totally disconnected. Because during the Cold War, you traded with other capitalist democratic allies. And you had security conflicts with people who were basically Eastern Bloc communists who didn't have economic ties with. So the fields of security studies and IPE could grow up and mature completely siloed off from each other, which left us utterly unprepared intellectually, as well as practically, for dealing with the post-Cold War world in which the same people who were your security threats were also your trading partners. The short answer to the question is we have no good theories for how to mix those two elements of power. And the practical situation we find ourselves in is like those old kind of Greco-Roman wrestling things in the Olympics in which you were tied together with one hand and you were trying to kill each other and beat each other up, but you couldn't, sort of, you were also tied together. And that's the fascination. And so the challenge, I think, is to figure out issue area ways in which you can, in effect, compartmentalize your policies. And so you agree that certain things you're going to do over here, and it doesn't, linkage is a dumb idea. It doesn't work in practice, and it just screws up the ability to cooperate. It either restrains you in areas you don't want to be restrained in, and it doesn't, it's great in theory, but you end up sacrificing things you want to do for not getting control over things that, other things. And so keeping lots of realms of policy separate from each other, if possible. Having a security competition, even as you have economic trade, even as you all get together for satellites and climate change research, is the right way to go, in my opinion.
But that's hard.
It's very hard, and it's
Because
not easily
as,
sum-upable.
Right, you as a president, no matter what party you're in, are going to face an opposing party in Congress that's going to say, you're being too soft on the great enemy that we face.
Absolutely. And this is where, dare one say it, I think that political leadership is absolutely crucial. Because not doing stupid things and doing things that are good, knowing when to resist, when to kowtow. With Roosevelt, the political aspects of Roosevelt used to bother me. And the way he approached U.S. entry into World War II and very belatedly maneuvered, and the way he, sold different things in different ways, it always struck me that it was better to have been more forthright. We would have entered the war early. And then I realized, this guy was an infinitely better politician than I was, and the way he did things was very, very wise. And if you look at Lincoln the Spielberg film Lincoln, or the JFK movie and play with the LBJ play. Both LBJ and Lincoln, and Roosevelt, these were masterful politicians who managed to stay in tune with public opinion and political reality while nudging it and moving it forward. And that's the kind of thing that we elect great politicians to do for us, because there's no book that tells you how to be like Lincoln, like these guys. Lincoln, but there are people who, at their best, that's what they can do.
Yeah. Please join me in thanking Gideon Rose. And a small token of our appreciation, souvenirs of Aggie Land.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy your evening.